Okay, so today's workshop is on participant observation. It will certainly not be an exhaustive conversation because participant observation means a lot of different things. It will depend on your questions, it will depend on your field, it will on itself. So this is just a kind of starting off point for a conversation, essentially. A quick and dirty guide, if you will. What is participant observation anyway? Now, the individual components of the word, the itself, participant observation, probably has some meaning to all of you. You know, in a sense, you, I'm sure, understand what participation means. You understand what observation means. What do these two things mean when they come together as a methodology for doing qualitative research? Now, according to H. Russell Bernard, whose materials I upload on BSpace, and I would definitely encourage you to take a look at, he has a very craft definition of what participant observation is. He says, and this is on slide 2, guys, on Hangout. He says, it's getting close to people and making them feel comfortable enough with your presence so that you can observe and record information about their lives. It involves deception and impression management. That's a bit salacious, especially the deception part, but part of what he's getting at, and we will probably talk about this during the course of our conversation here, is that people don't always know exactly what you're doing. And you may not always need them to know exactly what you're doing. They may know some components of what there, but you may not, for example, share your hypotheses with them because that would certainly shift the nature of your interactions, right? At the same time, as someone who is sort of embedding themselves in a particular research setting or even a culture, as the case may be, you're constantly going to be negotiating what people think you're doing, their impressions of you. So this is essentially what he's getting at. Apart from that, participant observation is what I like to think about as a continuum. It's neither full participation nor full observation. In fact, it can often swing in between those elements in a given interaction during the course of an entire fieldwork experience. You know, there will be moments where you're more a participant than an observer, and moments where you're more an observer than a participant. So they're not mutually exclusive categories. Apart from that, it produces many different types of data. It produces fields, it produces photographs, it produces audio recordings, it produces transcriptions from the interviews that you might conduct with people, etc., etc. Apart from that, H. Russell Bernard again tells us that immersing yourself in a culture and learning to remove yourself every day from that immersion so you can intellectualize what you've seen and heard. You're, through the course of fieldwork, putting this immersion into perspective, and you're writing about it convincingly. So there's constantly, in the course of participant observation, you're embedding yourself in the research setting. But then you pull away to sort of get an analytical distance, so you figure out, well, what is this all about? This is when you write about, this is when you write your jottings, or you actually write your jottings in the field, but this is when you write your field notes and things of that nature. And we'll get to what these things all mean very shortly. Apart from that, participant observation is skill, and it's a craft that can be acquired and honed. So part of what we're here to do today is to talk about ways that you can hone this skill set. Okay, moving on. What's the point of participant observation? One of the benefits is that it reduces what we call reactivity. What is reactivity? Reactivity is when your presence changes the nature of people's interactions, right? For example, if you go to interview someone about urban gardening in Senegal or religious practices in Japan, as the case may be, your presence, it could potentially be a disruptive element within that context. You're a stranger, nobody knows who you are, at least initially. What is this guy or, gal doing here? So people may begin to behave differently around you. However, when you engage in participant observation, which is premised on somewhat of a long-term sort of engagement, become less of what Bernard again calls a curiosity, meaning you become less of a stranger, and people are less likely to change their behavior while they're around you by virtue of the rapport you've developed with them. So in essence, you are becoming a part of the environment that you are doing research in. Apart from that, it enables a fuller understanding of the meaning of cultural phenomena from the perspective of the natives or setting. Now, natives can mean different things in different contexts. It could mean, people who are engaged in fitness activities, who, are CrossFit addicts. It could mean, people in China who are public transportation users. It could mean scientists in a laboratory, etc. But one of the key benefits of participant observation is that apart from something like an interview, which by itself is quite revealing, one of the difficulties with that particular qualitative method is that you may not know a person well enough to be able to gauge whether the responses they're giving you are in accordance with their actual beliefs and in accordance with people like them, right? If I meet you for the first time and within 15 minutes we're already conducting a formal interview, we don't really have a basis for that interaction. However, when you engage in something like participant observation, which will flesh out as we go along, you are deeply enmeshed in an environment. Over time, people get to know you better, right? You become sort of one with the people there to some extent. Maybe you engage in similar activities. Over time, you sort of develop a trust, and you gain a sense of who a person is and whether or not they can be trusted to some extent. Or if they can't be trusted, why they can't be trusted, what areas they can be trusted in. And so participant observation allows you that deeper interpretive knowledge that can only come from prolonged exposure. Apart from that, and again, or I should say that participant observation is one element within a research toolkit. For example, in my research, which transpired for 3 full years over the course of 6 years, right? So talking about long-term field work, I did participant observation. I also did quantitative methods. I also did qualitative in-depth interviews. So all of these things work together, right? And so while quantitative data, for example, gives us a sense of the sort of skeleton of social behavior, of phenomena, right? They give us sort of an aerial view, if you will, of what's happening, how many people are doing something, percentages, these kind of things. What participant observation does, according to Law, is widely considered to be the sort of father of modern anthropology and modern fieldwork, of which participant observation is a key part. What participant observation does is it produces the flesh and blood of social and cultural phenomena. It's the everyday. It gives you a sense of what things feel like, what people's experiences are like in a way that a statistic cannot. A statistic can't tell you what it feels like to be a child who's labeled a deviant or a disciplinary problem, right? You wouldn't know that child's mother, just recently got out of jail, per se, right? You wouldn't get that sort of those small scale details, those micro practices that make life interesting and colorful. Moving on. Apart from that, I'm going to talk very shortly about the sort of step-by-step of fieldwork, of participant observation, and what could be very practical ways of developing that skill set. However, it's also deeply important to think about and consider power dynamics, right? I mean, there's a reason why you did your city training about ethics in research, right? It's because there's a recognition that when you are working with human subjects, there's a potential to inflict harm by virtue of your research. So there's some things to consider, what I'm calling the thorny issue of ethics within participant observation. Now, the image that you'll see on slide 4 is the man I was just talking about, Bronislaw Malinowski, who wrote a very famous text called Argonauts of the Western Pacific, right after World War I. And it's a very sort of classical anthropological image. A white man in the midst of a bunch of non-white, scantily dressed people, right? This is kind of the classic image of the anthropologist, the ethnographer, and the native. And for better or for worse, this still is within the sort of genealogy of this methodology, right? So there's a couple of things that this history invites us to consider. On the one hand, we have to reckon with the fact that fieldwork, as we know it, participant observation, right, was framed in an imperial context, right? So for those of you who are somewhat familiar with anthropology or interested in anthropology or even ethnography as a practice, there are people who, you can't take the anthropologists seriously because they were the handmaidens of colonialism, right? Some of the early ethnographers, Malinowski, people of that era, they were essentially informants for colonial governments, right? Apart from that, fieldwork has historically been premised on power asymmetries and race, class, gender, national privileges. So Americans, Europeans get to go to, the developing countries, islands that, people don't visit super often, at least, in the earlier context of participant observation and in the early sort of developing stages of fieldwork. You go to the Trobriand Islands, you go to other places in Polynesia, it's for example, and you just go live amongst the natives. You go live in a hut somewhere, right? You can do that, but do people come to the US to do similar types of research? Could they get a visa to come? Could someone from Nigeria get a visa to come do research on American life, right? In a way, it sort of, by virtue of how we construct this type of research, it almost sounds ridiculous that someone would want to come do research here. But yet the reverse has been sort of naturalized, right? So if we think about some of the tendencies within this type of research, it's quite frankly a lot of white people going to study non-white people, right? And I won't dwell too much on that because what we're really here to talk about is the logistics, but you can't, really deny this history and this undercurrent and this possibility that when you go to places where you have power by virtue of the fact that you're a Berkeley student or you've been given money by this institution, you have the privilege of asking questions instead of, say, having to work a minimum wage job, right? These things enable us to go and do research. Not everyone has that, right? And so we are essentially basing our livelihood or our potential livelihoods in the future on people who typically have less power than us giving us information. There's a responsibility that comes with that, to act ethically, to make sure don't, go against the confidentiality agreement, things of this nature, something to always keep in mind. Apart from that, there's an imbalance in terms of costs and benefits, right? Some of you have small incentives for the people who choose to participate in your study. But let's say you go on to graduate school, you go on to become a professor in your field of study, or go on to continue with this line of work in another capacity. What you've gained from the people who have told you about their lives, about, their inner thoughts, in no way compares to what you have gained from basing your livelihood on their willingness to help you, right? And so I'm not trying to be sober because I see your faces look so serious right now.
I just never thought of it like that.
But I'm saying that because you have to think about it. And I know for me personally, I think a lot about ways that I can be of help to the people who've helped me. I mean, there's nothing I did to deserve the kindness that so many strangers have, conferred upon me. And so, I mean, we can talk about that at another time, but it's just something to keep in your mind. And then apart from that, you're going to constantly have to negotiate your privilege and your privilege. It's not always a sort of black and white issue of privilege in this context. So, for example, you might have privilege, going to do research in Nigeria. The fact that I have an American passport, right, is a source of privilege. The fact that I'm a woman was not always a source of privilege, right? The fact that, I look a certain way might not have been a source of privilege. So it's not always sort of one or the other, but it's something you continuously have to negotiate with the people that you're working with, right? Because not all of them will be purely disprivileged or privileged either, right? And it's very important, I would say, for all of you who are working with human subjects, which is all of you. There will be gatekeepers. There will be people who make things happen for you. In Berkay's case, it's might be the owner of the gym where you do your research. You have a relationship with this person. That person can either make or break your research. If they say, no, you can't work here anymore, guess what? We're done, right? In your case, Larry, it's the principal, it's the teachers, things of this nature. Managing those relationships is always a site in which we begin to examine the power relationships inherent in our endeavors here. Lightening up the mood. I want to talk to you a bit more about what we mean when we talk about participation and observation. So, on the participation side, and it's never usually fully participation because if it's just participation, then what are you doing? That's research, right? There has to be some sort of analytical distance that happens. But anyway, some of the characteristics or the typical characteristics of that side is, one, it's a bit of a moving target, right? Sometimes you're looking at people, sometimes it's places, sometimes it's events, sometimes it's practices, sometimes it's moves, sometimes it's objects. There's so many different things that might be the subject and focus of your participation/observation. Apart from that, the degree of participation can change over time and even in the course of one interaction. So, for example, when you first start out, people might not trust you. So the amount of access they give you to certain things may be limited, but over time that may change. Or conversely, give you full privileges to something, but let's say there's a closed door teacher meeting. They might say, sorry, Larry, you need to go. So you're managing different levels of participation. Apart from that, it's informal for the most part, but it's systematically informal. That sounds strange. How can you be sort of formally informal? Because that's kind of what I'm getting at. Even though a lot of the activities that you're going to be engaged in are unscripted, meaning that you may not exactly approximate what you are going to see or do or be asked to do, you are as much as possible going to try to make a routine out of it so that you can get the things that you need to get in order to answer the questions that you're trying to answer, right? So you're trying to impose an order on very disorderly phenomena, right? Life is not orderly. But yet, through the course of this method, you are going to try to gain hold of this sort of disorderly messiness of life, right? Apart from that, as it relates to the whole deception and impression management, you see that more here on the participation side. Not everyone may know or may need to know your purposes. There are some people that you may choose to tell more, And some people you may choose to tell less. You're not necessarily going to lie. That's not what deception here means, because that would actually be unethical. But you may not disclose fully, what you're thinking and the purpose behind what you're doing, right? Apart from that, in as much as you may do some sort of recordings, you're probably going to be relying more on jottings and field notes, which I'll talk about very shortly, what the difference is between those types of note-taking. And apart from that, it's inherently subjective and personal. All of us could go into the same setting. And in fact, I had originally planned for us to do a little mini field work in Sproul Plaza, but because we have people online, I wanted to do something that we all could do, right? But if we all went to Sproul Plaza right now, I can guarantee you that our recordings of what's happening would be somehow different. Even if they were generally similar, they would be somehow different, right? Subjective, personal. Now, on the observation side, often observation, and I mean sort of pure observation, they typically happen in formal settings where full participation is not possible or ethical. So, for example, a classroom, right? Larry, you're not a credentialed teacher, you can't teach, right? Or in Omar's case, he's going to be in a courtroom. He's not a legal practitioner, so he's limited in what he can do. Frank is not a priest, so I doubt he'll be leading sermons, right? So, there are sort of limits to what you can do in many settings, so observation becomes more useful. Apart from that, because you're sort of doing these formal observations, you tend to routinize it in certain ways. So I'm looking for certain things. I may even have a sheet of paper that has the same thing written on it, and every time I go to make my observation, I fill it out. The information might be different by virtue of, what's happening on that day, but generally speaking, you have a kind of routine of what you're looking at. Apart from that, it's less about deception and impression management because you're not really participating. You're just watching. Apart from that, the jottings and the field notes tend to be neutral and detached. They're less about how you feel or what it felt like to do something because you're not participating. There's often a clearly defined site or an occasion, and by that I mean it's a specific event, like a church activity or your Monday workout or sewing in the farm or a cultural event at the factory or, what have you. And apart from that, a lot of times it involves audio and video recordings because if you're in a defined space, Berkay, you will be using audio and visual recordings because you can, right? So step by step, now we're at the fun part. What does this actually look like? Well, I call this a non-normative guide because this will really depend on the nature of your work. And I'm speaking to a really diverse audience here of people who are doing very different types of things, right? But generally, I would say the nature of participant observation, the nature of sort of ethnographic fieldwork follows some version of this. So the first step, which is kind of what we were talking about before, is preparation. What are my questions? What places do I need to experience? What things do I need to do? What people do I need to interact with? What things do I need to take note of? These are kind of the things you use to prime yourself so that you can make sure that you're sort of getting the most out of your interactions. Apart from that, or after that, is hanging out. Anthropologists are professional hangout artists. We kick it very seriously. And it's actually quite serious because it's hanging out And I use that sort of loosely, but what I'm talking about really is sort of getting into an environment and sort of understanding the lay of the land, right? Whether it's a school, whether it's a diocese, whether it's a particular neighborhood, whether it's a gym, whether it's a workplace environment, whether it's like a public transportation network, a laboratory, a city, etc. You need to get to know like the spaces, the places, the people, the things that are of importance to that environment, to that phenomena, right? So what does that mean? I mentioned this earlier. Look at field sites with the eyes of a stranger. Hang out in strategic spaces with strategic people. Build rapport, become known. Take note of the local language. And by local language, I don't necessarily mean like Wolof. I mean the way people talk about things. You're probably going to find that there are words that sort of emerge as kind of key phrases that people use to understand what's going on, right? And so you should take careful note of them because those are the things that are going to add richness and depth to your study when you write it up. These are the kind of conceptual and theoretical interventions you'll be able to make because these are how local people, the natives, if you will, of your particular research setting, understand what is happening around you. As a participant observer are there to find out, right? You are there to figure out what's of popular interest, right? And at this stage, when you're just sort of kicking it and sort of getting into the groove, you're casting a very wide net, right? You may not fully know what's interesting yet. And what I mean by interesting is analytically interesting, right? After that is what I'm calling take note. And this is slide 7 for the Google Hangout folks. Take note. So you're going to make jottings in your notebook or your phone as you go on throughout your day. You don't want to be too attached to your notes because then you sort of draw undue attention to yourself and the fact that you're doing research. And I know if I see someone taking notes and watching me, I'm going to look at that person crazy. Don't have people look at you crazy. Okay? Be as inconspicuous as you can. Be in the moment. That's another reason why you don't want your head in a notebook. And this is also why it's important to hone your ability to recall things. Because you don't want to miss what's happening because you're like this. Right? Apart from that, have an idea of what you're looking for. This is the point at which you begin to narrow your focus, progressively. Right? As you've sort of started to hear the type of things or see the type of things that seem analytically interesting, you start following those leads. Maybe it's a person who seems particularly influential. Maybe it's a set of activities that seem particularly influential. But you start to follow these leads and hunches, right, over time as things sort of emerge. And then you can capture images, audio, and video when appropriate so that, you'll add depth to your recall. You'll be able to come back to them. You'll be able to use that as additional data. Then, retreat and recall. It's always very important, no matter how much you immerse yourself in your research setting, to step away. Maybe it's a day or two a week. Maybe it's a particular time of day, depending on the nature of your research. But you always need what I'm calling me time. You need space to think about what you're doing as a researcher. Okay? It's at this point that you also expand your jottings into full field notes. You probably should set a few hours aside for this because it takes time to expand from jottings to field notes. And I'll talk about a little bit about what that actually means. You also at this point make interpretive notes on questions or analytical hunches you have. You begin to make sense of the descriptions that you took before, right? So there's a kind of descriptive mode. There's also an analytical mode, right? Apart from that, you reassess your game plan. I've been spending a lot of time with this person. Have I reached the kind of end of that line, right? A lot about this issue, or I've been observing this practice. Do I need to move on to something else? Or, wow, I really have been missing out on this particular thing. This has been going on right underneath my nose. How can I go back and sort of figure out what's been going on there, right? So reassess. And these are not necessarily progressive steps. They're recursive, and, it's more like I'm making, I don't know what this motion means, but it's a little bundle of activities. But you invite contributions. These could be from the people that are some people call them informants. My advisor has always called them interlocutors, and I like that way of thinking about the people you work with in the course of your research, because informant kind of implies something very scandalous about that framing, right? It sounds like someone's a snitch, or like you're doing something super underhanded, right? Top secret. But interlocutor implies that you're having a conversation. And, depending on the type of research ethos you have, personally, I'm someone who believes in sort of participatory research. Part of this is because I do research in educational institutions, so I'm researching research institutions, so it only makes sense to invite the contributions of intellectuals, right, right? But anyway, regardless of where you're doing your research, it could be useful to ask some people after you've known them, not when you first meet them, to invite them to give you their impressions on what's going on, right? After you've developed that rapport with them. This could be informally, this could be in an actual in-depth interview, but, it's usually good to get a sense from the people who are the experts on something, what they think of your impressions, right? Apart from that, you should also talk to your mentors and faculty sponsors like me, your faculty sponsor, etc., each other, about some of the hunches you're following, right? Because we may likely have some input too. And also, it's at that point, I'm a huge proponent of, not starting out with interviews. I mean, there's some cases where you kind of have to start there. You don't really, if you have a very short window of opportunity with someone, you kind of have to interview them. That's your interaction with them. But when at all possible, you always get more out of people when you know them a bit better. They trust you. They are more likely to be honest and give you more in-depth and richer responses, right? Because they're invested in you in a certain kind of way. And it's not, I'm not saying that in a sort of strategic sense, like, hang out with this person so that you can get great interviews. Like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it's a kind of ethical consideration, I would argue, to ensure that you produce the most reliable data. And you're also talking about human beings here, I don't want to personally invest my time in someone who is only here to get some sound bites from me, right? It's not a great feeling, I would imagine. So as much as possible, I would definitely encourage you to find ways to sort of build a rapport in a relationship so that it's some kind of meaningful exchange. And then What comes out of all this is ethnography. What comes out of all this magically is this rich description and analysis. I mean, we'll talk more later about articulating findings. That's going to be an even more convoluted conversation because there's no easy way to arrive at conclusions. But, if you do these things, at some point you will arrive at some kind of understanding, right? So let's talk about the nitty-gritty of notes themselves. I know Meg had a question about this in her response, and it's a really important point. We've talked about what participant observation is, like from a conceptual level. We've talked about, various components of it, but okay, Crystal, what does that look like? Well, I'll tell you. I will tell you. To me. Now, there are a couple of kinds of notes. There are jottings or scratch notes that are usually taken in the course of your observations and your participation. There's diaries, there are logs, there are field notes, there are audio-visual notes, if you will. You don't have to use all of these. I was not a faithful keeper of a diary. I didn't have time for all that, to be quite honest with you. I didn't. I kept a log sometimes, but sometimes not. But I wish I had. So you might consider that. But I always did my jottings. And what are jottings? Jottings are things you might keep in something that looks a little notebook here. So something, or this, a cell phone. Something happens. Someone says something. Something catches you by surprise. Whatever the case may be, you may want to be able to recall certain things, the sequence of an event. You might need to scratch out a few notes on a pad for later. You're obviously not going to be in the midst of action, in the midst of a workout, writing out full field notes. That sounds crazy and not super helpful to you at that moment. So you'll want to find a way to create some notes that will purely jog your memory. That's the purpose of the jotting. It jogs your memory for later. Don't overdo it. People are watching you. People know what you're there to do. Maybe they don't, but maybe they do. But I can guarantee you that if you're watching something with your head in a notebook, you look suspicious and or crazy. And you don't need that kind of attention. So you'll probably have to, and in some settings this might not matter at all. Like, for example, I'm thinking Meg, in a lab setting, people probably won't care that you're taking copious notes, right? But in other settings, or in Larry's case, because they know you're there to make observations, it might not be strange that you're doing that. Even Burkay, I feel like it'll be so clear that you're observing these things, that might not be strange. But if you're in Domino's, Jason, and you're like, taking notes and looking at people, or even if you're in the middle of mass, Frank, that looks crazy. So you'll probably have to figure out some strategic ways to jog your memory for later. Or like in the midst of an informal conversation. I remember the struggle. People are saying some juicy things that I'm just like, oh, I can see where that's going in my, dissertation, et cetera, et cetera. How do I capture this right now? I sent a text. That was I suddenly had to send a text, which was actually a jotting, but they didn't need to know that, right? A diary. Now, this is totally up to you, but depending on what you're doing, it could be very helpful to have a kind of personal assessment of how you're feeling as you go through the research so that you can reflect sort of reflexively about, yourself in the experience of doing research, right? The log could be very useful in terms of, number one, sort of recording certain incidents. So this thing happened on this date. I spent this many hours doing this thing. That kind of quantifiable data could be very useful. For me, the logs that I created were very sort of strategic. In educational institutions in Nigeria, there are a lot of infrastructural issues. So I created a log of when there was electricity. So some months there would be, or some weeks, there would be electricity for 2 hours a day. Sometimes it would be 12 hours a day. So that had a direct correlation, or not a direct correlation, but there was some correlation between those periods of no electricity and political activity, and particularly protest, or when there was no water for a long period of time. So these kind of things were very useful for me. Apart from that, your field notes, which are really the bread and butter of participant observation, and we'll talk about this a bit more extensively, but field notes, which are the expansion of your jottings, have a couple of different dimensions, right? So they can be methodological. You can make notes of ways that you want to revise your methodology. Okay, I need to interview this person. Okay, this particular site was not happening, so I need to go somewhere else. Oh, I need to make sure I attend these events or take note of these things. This kind of thing. Things that will help you frame how you're approaching your research. Apart from that, the biggest component is description. Literally what is happening, what you observed, what you participated in. Apart from that, there's an analytical component. Your thoughts on what you think it all means. You're probably going to be wrong sometimes, probably a lot of times, but over time, your analysis will, cumulatively sort of blossom, and you'll get a better sense of what it all means, or what you think it all means. Apart from that, audio-visual elements in my field notes, I often included images that I captured, or video that I captured, or, when it was appropriate, I might have had to sketch out something like, this was what this place looked like, a little map, if you will, these kind of things. What goes in a note, you ask? Very important question. So here's some things that you might want to jot down. You might want to jot down what Clifford Geertz, who is a very important figure within ethnography and anthropology, thick, which means very deep and rich descriptions of the physical setting, what a room looks like, what a space looks like, how many people are there. If you describe an activity and there's 10 people versus 100 people versus 5,000 people, these things matter. If someone is dressed a particular way, if you've read good ethnography, you know that you feel like you're there, right? And so you want to capture the descriptions that will color what you eventually write, that will allow your reader to understand what it might feel like to be a CrossFit, participant, or what it feels like to be disciplined in a classroom, or the type of things that are happening within a Catholic sort of ritual within the Japanese context versus any other context, or the specific physical, visceral challenges of farming in Senegal, right, in Dakar, etc. I could go on, but I feel like you get my point. Apart from that, what are the activities taking place? What are the social interactions, verbal and nonverbal? Are there ways that people are sort of physically interacting with each other? There's this very famous essay that Clifford Geertz wrote in this text called The Interpretation of Culture. It's called Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. And some of you read that. It's this amazing, long, but really amazing piece of writing that completely takes you into the world of a cockfight in Bali. And you realize that a cockfight is not just a cockfight. Just like something that appears one way, it means so much more by virtue of your interpretation of it. And one of the things that he talks about in that text is, how do you know the difference between a wink and a twitch of the eye? They're actually the same thing physically, right? You're at this, but only that deep ethnographic richness and analysis will tell you that no, that eye movement is a wink, which could be subversive, it could be, salacious, it could be flirty, versus a twitch, which is an involuntary, physiological response. Maybe I have an allergic reaction to something. It's ethnographic detail which comes from participant observation that will differentiate between these things. Apart from that, you might take note of behaviors, what you expect to see but don't see, and vice versa. Words and phrases that people use that are analytically interesting or strange to you. Paraphrases or short quotes of interactions or things that people say. Apart from that, all good field notes have a few things. We're on slide 10, by the way. They have codes. We also call these tags in the social media world. That's how I think about them. So codes for people, places, events, themes that are beginning to arise. Hopefully, if we have some time, I can pull up Evernote. But within Evernote, you have the capacity to take field note or to record notes, embed multimedia, but also to create tags that could be as codes for you that will become very useful later analytically. Right? They also have date, time, location, basic details. Pseudonyms for places and people when appropriate. They also have multimedia, as I mentioned before. But anyway, this is from the same H. Russell Bernard text that is on BSpace, and this is a field note that he included. Now, we don't have to, you can read this to yourself, but what you'll note at the top is that there's a number of codes. I personally didn't code like this. I use sort of descriptive tags, but, when you are writing your field notes, you might want to put some preliminary tags on them. Classroom observation, or, the pseudonyms or the names of the people involved in the activity, or a particular thematic element that you see, disciplinary action, suspension, worker satisfaction, worker dissatisfaction, whatever key terms are useful. You may change those tags after you are done with your field work, once you've kind of fine-tuned them, but you can put some preliminary sort of descriptors on your field note. But if we look at this, there are a couple of things that we'll notice. One, clearly this is not a jotting, right? This is prose that presumably was expanded from original scratch notes. So it reads, although the mess is open, I'm assuming that's cafeteria, I rarely see any of the crew being with scientists on this cruise. This was the case on the other cruise too. The crew takes a lot less time to eat than the scientists who sit around, quote, shooting the science, quote, unquote, after dinner, as PJ says. There's a shortage of mess seats and people have to eat in shifts. PJ says that it annoys him to see scientific personnel just sitting around and lingering over coffee after dinner when they could be letting others sit down. Quote, that's just another example of how obtuse these guys are, unquote. as I was considering his use of the word obtuse, he said, quote, "They're so wrapped up in themselves, they just don't think about other people," unquote. Now, there's a couple of things that you might notice here. One, this is description. There's not a whole lot of analysis going on here, and field notes are not primarily about analysis. That can be added later. And in fact, I would often review my field notes and add my analytical notes, but in like a different color or a different font so that I could distinguish them from the initial notes that I'd made. You'll also see that, there's some strategic short quotes here. And, you'll have to develop a way of differentiating between direct quotes and paraphrases, because this will become important when you're actually writing things up. You don't want to attribute things to people that they didn't actually say, even if it's a pseudonym. Apart from that, you'll see that there's a notice or a note about the use of specific language that has meaning in this context. Obtuse, right? Obtuse means something in the world, but obtuse also means something specific in this context, right? So these are some of the things you might want to include in a field note. Included here a very random note of mine from my field work taken in June 2012. And this is a screen cap of Evernote, actually, which is what happened was I'm pretty sure that I was taking notes on my cell phone, and then I emailed my jottings to myself. And then later, the event itself took place on June 22nd, but I put it into Evernote on the 29th, clearly. And so I had visited the boys' quarter, the BQ, which is like a little in-law suite of a student at Leeds City University. And he was telling me about the sort of creative strategies, really cheating actually, that some students deploy to submit their theses. So a final project is a thesis in this context. So I'm basically paraphrasing what our conversation was. So he tells me that paying someone to write a project or a thesis is common. 15K or 15,000 Naira is typical. The photocopier is a graduate, so the person who works at the photocopy, what's that place called? Copy Central. One of the attendants there is actually a graduate of a university. He has a list of thesis topics to choose from. His own is different. He brought 3 topics. His supervisor amended it, so the guy had to write that project. So he was going to give him a ready-made thesis, but his advisor told him, no, you have to do something slightly different. So he had to pay this guy to actually write a whole other thesis. He tried, meaning he did a good job. He read through it but didn't add anything. His is better. Most people buy already written projects. So he's saying that he's justifying what he's doing because he didn't just buy a project, he had a very specific project made for him. Even from the same different one, cheating is common. At other schools, lecturers ask you to pay them in order to get their thesis approved. Lewis knows T-Cool, who is another student at another university. And then I write, and this is an analytical note, Buccaneer. A Buccaneer is a secret campus cult, which is sort of like a gang, basically. It's a cross between, I would say, a fraternity and a gang. T-Cool said, the same T-Cool, said we go to Above Jordan's place, which is a senior politician. T-Cool is a politician at another university. Above Jordan is a former student politician who is now in mainstream politics. So we were supposed to go to his place at 3 p.m. 3 p.m. came and went. When I called T-Cool at 4:30 p.m., the phone just rang, meaning he didn't answer. This was his plan, I'm sure. I am pretty sure at this point that he never planned on us going together. He doesn't know if I'm working for Labsy. And this is Labsy is another student politician. And what I'm really talking about is what I was saying earlier about managing relationships with people, which is that Tikul and Labzi are political enemies. I have relationships with both of them. Tikul at this time is not sure if I'm aligned with Labzi or not. So he says we're going to go do something with this senior politician. But he actually cuts me out of the arrangement because he isn't sure if he can trust me at this point. And then I write, I don't even blame him, which is true. So you see a kind of preliminary code included through Evernote, which is lead city. And then you see some pure description with scant interpretive notes and questions. Now, my methodology for writing field notes does not have to be yours, but I'm just giving you a small sample of different ways that you could approach writing notes. I know exactly what my notes are talking about. They should be clear that anyone could read them, but at the same time, what's most important that you know what's going on, right? And that if I wanted to use this field note, I could talk about academic integrity, for example. I could talk about political alliances, right? I could talk about sort of cross-institutional political relationships, etc.